Russia, and previously the Soviet Union, was once famed for having the strongest tank fleet in the world. Its T-34 tanks were invaluable in defeating the Nazis during World War II, and its vast Cold War tank force made it one of the world's most daunting military superpowers of that era. But times have changed. Covered in rust and held together with duct tape, Russia's tank fleet is a far cry from the mighty force it once was. No longer a symbol of strength, it's now a reflection of the desperation facing the country's armed forces as they resort to increasingly drastic measures to cover up their losses and keep up the pressure on Ukraine. This is the truth about Russia's tanks today. First, there are the losses. When the war with Ukraine kicked off in early 2022, expert estimates suggested that Russia had more than 16,000 tanks in total, with around 3,300 of them in a fully operational, combat-ready state. Most of the others were older Soviet models, kept in storage facilities for decades, just in case the Russian army ever needed them. At the time, Russia's commanders most likely thought their force was more than strong enough to overwhelm any Ukrainian resistance. They had a good mixture of powerful modern tanks like the T90M, along with older but still reasonably reliable options like T80s. With so much firepower at their disposal and a much smaller force standing in their way, the Russians probably expected to roll on through Ukraine, blowing away any obstacles on the rapid road to victory. They were wrong. As is known now, Ukraine's resistance was far greater than the Russians had ever expected. The Ukrainian armed forces defended their land with remarkable resolve, and countless civilians signed up to join the fight. It didn't take long for the first Russian tanks to fall by the wayside. Using mines, missiles, and later drones, Ukraine took out one after another, and when Western aid came in the forms like US Javelin missiles and British NLAW anti-tank weapons, the numbers of destroyed Russian tanks rose even further. Russia didn't exactly do a great job in looking after its tanks either. In the early weeks and months of the war, numerous reports emerged of tanks being sent into dangerous areas without relevant reinforcements and supporting units, so they were quickly cornered and destroyed. Other reports spoke of some tanks being ambushed by Ukrainian forces, cleverly utilizing their home ground advantage, and others getting stuck in dense urban environments they were never designed to operate in. There were also cases of Russian tank crews being sent to the front lines without sufficient amounts of training and combat experience, inevitably leading to more costly mistakes, casualties, and losses. And those losses have added up bit by bit as the war has progressed. It's almost impossible to know exactly how many Russian tanks have been destroyed, as estimates vary from source to source. Ukraine's armed forces, for example, claim to have taken out their 10,000th Russian tank in February of this year. Meanwhile, the open-source intelligence outlet, Oryx, reports just over 4,000 Russian tank losses, all of which have been independently confirmed using open-source media, like satellite images and videos from the front lines. It's likely the true figure sits somewhere between those two extremes. However, even if Oryx is 100% accurate, 4,000 tanks is still a staggering number for Russia to lose. It's a greater number than the 3,300 fully operational tanks the country started the war with, and it's more tanks than most countries around the world have in total. Even for a country like Russia, which is famed for its huge historical tank fleet and large-scale tank production, such losses are utterly unsustainable, and the country has been forced to adjust its tactics accordingly. That's one of the reasons why Russia focused so heavily on drone warfare in recent months, sending record levels of drones into Ukraine to damage its infrastructure and slaughter its civilians. Drones are dramatically cheaper than tanks and much easier to mass produce, so the Kremlin can easily throw thousands of them at Kyiv and other targets each month without worrying too much when most of them get shot down. Russia's frontline assaults too have transformed dramatically in recent times, with far fewer tanks and armoured vehicles sent into the fray. Instead, troops are often ordered into Ukrainian territory on foot or on board cars or motorbikes. The tanks, meanwhile, are mostly kept far from the front lines in relative safety. But Russia can't simply stop using tanks entirely. It needs its heavy armour to keep up the pressure in key areas and spearhead charges into cities and fortified towns it wants to take over, like Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. However, with so many tanks already destroyed, there are only two ways for Russia to keep up the pressure: either make more tanks or bring older ones out of storage. It's doing its best to make more tanks, having tripled the production rate of its T90Ms to the point where it can now make an estimated 300 new ones each year. But they're extremely expensive, with each one worth around $4.5 million. Russia's other modern main battle tank, the T90 Armata, is even more pricey, with new units costing between $5 and $9 million to make. They're so expensive that some analysts believe Russia is too scared to deploy them. So, after investing all that time and money into creating these cutting-edge tanks with their state-of-the-art control systems, allegedly world-class weaponry, and super strong defenses, Russia doesn't actually intend to use them. And this isn't just a rumor or theory, it's something that Russian officials have openly spoken about. Sergei Chemezov, CEO of the state-owned defense conglomerate Rostec and close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, admitted, "The Armata in general is a little expensive. In terms of functionality, it is of course much superior to existing tanks, but it's too valuable, so the army is unlikely to use it now. It's easier for them to buy the same T90s. The CEO also admitted that Russia needed to look at cheaper alternatives wherever possible, stating, "Now we need money to create new tanks, new weapons, perhaps cheaper ones. Therefore, if there is an opportunity to buy cheaper ones, why not?" So, while Russia can afford to make new tanks, it can't really afford to risk losing them in Ukraine. As such, its only remaining option is to dig through old Soviet storage facilities scattered across the country in a desperate attempt to bring decades-old tanks into a modern-day fight. Open source intelligence analysts have been keeping a close eye on those facilities in recent months, and back in July, one of those analysts, who goes by the name Jompy on X, revealed that Russia was attempted to revive multiple mothballed T72A tanks, most of which date back to the late 1970s, making them almost 50 years old. In a July 14 post, Jompy wrote, "Based on recent signs at major tank storage bases, like the 349th that hold T72As, it appears Russia is prepping them to bring them back to service." He went on to share satellite images of some of the bases in question, showing the tank movements over time. He also explained that these tanks were largely in poor or very poor condition, which is hardly surprising given their age and the fact that many have been simply sitting in the same spot for several decades, gradually getting covered up with rust, dust and dirt. In short, no major military force would willingly want to use tanks like these. Even if they weren't rusty and ragged, they'd still be utterly unfit for purpose, since they're so enormously outdated by today's standards. So many modern tanks are dramatically superior to the T72A in every key aspect, from mobility to defensive fortitude and offensive capabilities. For example, the T72A comes equipped with a 780 horsepower diesel engine and can reach peak speeds of around 37 miles per hour on good ground, but is much slower on tough terrain or when driving in reverse. World-leading tanks like the US M1 Abrams meanwhile have 1,500 horsepower engines to allow them to reach noticeably faster speeds. The T72A also lacks the modern transmission and suspension systems of today's tanks that allow them to tackle rough and rocky ground with ease. And it's a nightmare for crews to ride around in, with cramped quarters and a deadly automatic loading system that can turn the entire tank into a blazing inferno if struck in just the right place by enemy missiles or drones. Even in terms of offensive output, the T72A is light years away from the tanks of the 21st century. It lacks advanced fire control systems and capabilities needed to rapidly identify enemy targets and calculate the perfect firing angles to successfully and consistently hit them. And when it comes to defense, T72As might have been fine in Cold War era conflicts, but they weren't able to withstand kamikaze drones and smart bombs. They don't have the necessary defenses seen on superior modern models like the K2 Black Panther. They have zero active protection systems, no explosive reactive armor, and next to no defenses against guided rocket impacts or drones flying straight at their weakest points. In other words, bringing T72As into modern-day battlefields would be like the US Army showing up to a fight armed with World War II style bolt-action rifles. It's a move that's doomed to fail, and try as they might, there's no way that the Russians can make these ancient tanks ready for modern military action. But that's how desperate they are. In a more recent post, published on August 6, John P. issued a new update, revealing that Russia was indeed in the process of getting its T72As ready to enter the fray. And just like that, there are a lot of likely T72As parked in the yards outside UVZ now. Probably some T72Bs from the 1311th as well. Surely they'll be refurbished sooner or later. Now, the UVZ John P. refers to is the short term for UralVagonZavod, which is one of Russia's largest scientific and industrial complexes and the biggest main battle tank manufacturer on the planet. It's based in the city of Nizhny Tagil, deep in Russian territory and more than 1,000 miles from the Ukrainian border. When tanks show up outside UralVagonZavod, it usually means that they're about to be taken into the factory for repairs, refurbishment, and possible modernization before being shipped off to the front lines. The very fact that Russia is even thinking of taking T72As into the fight is extraordinary, but it also shows just how bad the situation has become, because these are some of the oldest and weakest tanks left in the fleet. When the war began, Russia had many other Soviet tanks in its storage facilities, including the slightly more modern T72B variants, which were made in the mid-1980s and boasted several improvements over the T72As, like new main guns, stabilizers, fire control systems, guided missile systems, strong defensive armor, and even a more powerful engine. Naturally, as Russia's initial tank supply started to run low, it first turned to tanks like the T72Bs, finding those that were still semi-usable and sending them to the factory for refurbishment. Open source analysts spotted this too. John P. wrote back in late July, "It would appear whatever stock of T72Bs held by UVZ at their own facilities is now exhausted, as the Russians have restarted to take T72Bs stored at the 1311th base to be refurbished at that factory. The stock probably won't last long. I estimate they pulled 20 per month." But it seems that the T72B stocks are already running low, or perhaps Russian forces weren't able to restore as many as they thought they could. So they're turning to the T72As. There are believed to be around 1,000 of these tanks in total, though it's likely that a large percentage of them are too far gone to be repaired. And even those that Russia is able to dress up a little will still have all the same flaws that have plagued this tank for generations, like its awful auto-loader design and the fact that the main gun is extremely inaccurate whenever the tank is in motion. In comparison, Ukraine's oldest frontline tanks are Leopard 1A5s. They're not exactly a match for the latest and greatest tank models like K2 Black Panthers and M1A2 Abrams, but they're still newer and stronger than T72As. They were made in the 1980s and, at the very least, feature stabilized guns that allow them to accurately fire on targets even while maneuvering around the battlefield. Ukraine has also received shipments of multiple strong Western tank models from its NATO allies, like M1 Abrams from the US, Challenger 2 tanks from the UK, and Leopard 2 tanks from Germany. Thus, in one-on-one tank fights with Russia's Soviet relics, Ukraine clearly holds the advantage. And the T72As aren't the only vintage tanks the Kremlin is using to bolster its fleet. Additional open source intelligence analysis has revealed that Russia is also currently relying quite heavily on T62s, which are even older. These tanks entered service with the Soviet Army back in 1961, but were deemed obsolete and put into reserve service in the 1970s, with the T72 and T80 replacing them. The technical specifications of the T62 are, from a Russian perspective, embarrassing. They have weak and weedy 580 horsepower engines and can only reach peak speeds of just 31 miles per hour, making them dramatically slower than all major modern battle tanks. They have none of the advanced equipment found in today's tanks either, like laser rangefinders, thermal sights, and onboard ballistic computers. Whether looking at mobility, offensive output, defensive strength, or tactical technology, the T62 is lacking in every area that matters. They're regarded as so old and effectively worthless by today's standards that when Ukrainian forces captured dozens of them in the early stages of the war, they decided to repurpose them into personal carriers and recovery vehicles. They removed the turrets and guns to make the tanks much lighter and more mobile, then rolled them out for specialist missions, like helping more modern tanks escape from mud pits or tough terrain, or aiding in the construction of temporary bridges. Yet Russia is still using T-62s for their original purpose as main battle tanks. Unsurprisingly, it's also losing them in large numbers, according to recent analytical data from War Spotting. War Spotting looked at Russia's tank losses over a 6-month spell from February of this year up to the beginning of August, examining which types of tanks Russia had lost each month and making some interesting findings along the way. First, the analysts noticed that Russian tank losses fell quite notably in June and July, which saw just 22 and 19 losses respectively, compared to earlier months which saw up to 70 tanks lost in total. Analysis also showed that T-72 tanks account for the largest parts of Russia's losses, followed by T-80s and in third place the humble T-62. And when looking at figures from July, T-62s actually topped the list, with 6 of them confirmed to have been destroyed compared to just 4 T-72s, 2 T-80s and 2 T-90s. T-64 tanks also show up in War Spotting's data. They were designed way back in the 1950s and entered production in 1963, making them just as outdated and obsolete as the likes of the T-62 and T72A. One can only imagine the terrible condition some of these tanks must be in. Covered in rust and dirt, with guns, turrets and other key components barely staying in place and struggling to move, they're essentially big metal death traps for the unfortunate crews that climb on board. And even those that are restored and partially modernized at UralVagonZavod facilities are still exceptionally out of date by today's standards, with limited survivability and no real chance of dealing any lasting damage on the battlefields of Ukraine. In other words, they're little more than cannon fodder that Russia is throwing out in order to save face and maintain the illusion of power and pressure in this war. Any soldiers chosen to drive these old rust buckets into battle must feel like they're being sent on suicide missions by their commanders, and with each successive tank loss, morale among the Russian ranks is surely on a sharp, dramatic decline. This strategy, like so many other elements of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is not sustainable. There are only so many tired old tanks Russia can dig out of storage and send to the battlefields of Donetsk, Kharkiv and Kherson to be blown up by Ukrainian rockets and drones. They'll run out eventually and then find themselves facing an impossible dilemma, where they either have to attempt to win a large-scale war without any heavy armor, or risk their most expensive tanks like the T90Ms and T14 Armatas and face the extreme economic consequences when at least some of those tanks are inevitably destroyed. It's a lose-lose situation for Moscow with no clear way out. The current plan isn't working and there's no real backup. So Russia persists with its foolish and wasteful tactics, hoping that somehow something will change. For now, the country still has enough recruits entering its army to keep up the pressure, even as tank numbers continue to decline, with around 30,000 new additions each month. That's enough to counterattack the estimated 20,000 casualties it endures in the same time frame, according to Euromaidan Press. But eventually, the numbers of willing and able-bodied soldiers will also start to seriously drop. The economy will crumble even further, and any remote prospect of a Russian victory will continue to slip away into nothingness. Now, you can learn more about how the Russian war machine is running on empty in our recent detailed breakdown of the shocking statistics staring Putin right in the face. Or check out our latest video looking at Ukraine's plans to construct an impenetrable yet invisible wall of static that could nullify entire swarms of Russian drones in an instant. And finally, be sure to subscribe to our trusted news channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on all the latest news and developments from the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts around the world.